All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Brittany Dufilli. I'm the Educational and Outreach Coordinator here at Vertex. Today, we have Stephen Helms, the Senior Product Manager from WatchGuard Technologies, and he's going to be sharing the importance of the Zero Trust approach. We're going to go ahead and let Stephen kick that off.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Brittany, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Very excited to be here. So my name is Stephen Helm. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at WatchGuard Technologies. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for roughly 10 years, started out with a data protection organization, and now spent the last 5 years here at WatchGuard Technologies. And I'm very excited to share with you the importance of zero trust approaches. And so for an agenda today, we'll start out with a brief discussion on the threat landscape and really look at the numbers to start and what are the dynamics that we've seen really in the last 12 months to 18 months. Then we'll dive into some specific hacks that you probably have heard about in the headlines, talk about really what occurred with each one of those breaches, what the initial causes were, and some lessons learned potentially from each one of those. Then we'll just start talking a little bit about how the landscape has really changed. And some of this is the COVID-19 dynamic, but some of this is the continuation of really a long-term change that we've seen in the threat landscape and the cybersecurity industry at large. Then we'll introduce the importance of zero trust and start talking about what zero trust is, why it's important, what the foundational principles are, and why you should consider it for your business. We'll talk about risk-based segmentation as sort of a subtopic here, and why that it can be very interesting and help simplify security approaches before really digging into how WatchGuard delivers zero trust for different organizations. And we'll leave a brief time at the end of the presentation for question and answer, but feel free to drop questions in the chat and I'll get to them as best as I'm able as I go through the presentation today. And so I sort of start with an old quote here, but one that really I think is always been funny and very, very relevant today for reasons you'll see as I go through this presentations. And that is, passwords are like underwear. Don't let people see it, change it very often, and you shouldn't share it with strangers, right? And so I said I've been in this industry for over 10 years, so this is a little bit predating me, but still extremely relevant. Even in 2008, everyone recognized that passwords were a weak point and credentials more broadly were a weak point in security. And that's absolutely still the case, and we'll see why that is here throughout this presentation. And so just to start with the threat landscape really by the numbers, and I have a number of attacks here on the right-hand side, and I'll dig into each one of those individually. The first thing I want to call out is that phishing accounts for more than 80% of reported security incidents. And for those of you on the call who might not really understand what phishing is, typically phishing attacks use email to exploit your users to hand over their credentials or get them to take an action, maybe click a link that delivers malware to their machines. Really, the point that you need to understand about phishing is it's exploiting your users to get entry into your secure environment. Google registered over 2 million phishing sites as of January of this year, and that was a 27% increase in the last 12 months, or in the 12 months preceding January. This really shouldn't be a surprise to folks on the call. More and more people obviously are working from home, they're off their corporate network, they're in their home offices, they're in more distracted environments. Cyber actors have really seized on this from a phishing perspective and escalated their phishing attacks to really exploit these users as they're really at their own mercy within these home networks. We've also seen malware increase by 358% overall, and ransomware increased by 435% year over year. So these are obviously very dramatic increases, and they speak to actually the exploitation of, again, endpoints that these users are using outside of their traditional network perimeter. So again, these devices, when they're connected within a corporate network, they're being typically protected by a firewall, and once they move outside of that, unless they're using something like a VPN or some of the other security approaches there, they're very much more under threat from malware or vulnerable to malware. And then the final stat I'll leave you with here on this slide is that 94% of malware is delivered via email. And I think this is very important because there's a tendency to believe that malware infections happen because of risky clicks as people surf around the internet and maybe go to places that they shouldn't. The actuality is that 94% is delivered via email, meaning 94% is targeted or sent to your users and has them take the action to really start that attack. And so it really comes down to this, the idea of protecting your users, protecting credentials, protecting the endpoints they use. And so we'll flesh those ideas out as we go through the presentation. I also wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at some of the big headline breaches that hopefully you've heard about or are relevant to you that we've seen really in the last 12 months. And the first one I'll start out with is probably the most headline grabbing one that we've seen in 12 months, maybe in quite some time, quite frankly. And that's the Colonial Pipeline hack. And they're one of the largest pipelines in the United States. If you recall, there was a lot of panic about oil costs increasing and the availability of things like gasoline. So there was lines at pumps, and some of that was based on reality. Some of that was based on just insecurity about where that folks would get the fuel that they needed for their vehicles. But what you need to understand is that what really happened from the attack perspective is that Colonial Pipeline's billing system is what was compromised, not their operational technology systems. That is to say, it wasn't the pipelines, the actual devices, the SCADA systems of the Colonial Pipeline infrastructure that were hacked, but actually their billing technology. And so that was why they had to halt operations, because they didn't have the ability to bill their customers. And they actually shut down the pipeline more as a precaution because they weren't confident that they could prevent that ransomware from spreading to some of those SCADA systems and potentially actually compromising the pipeline itself. So out of precaution, they took down the pipeline for a period of time. The hackers stole nearly 100 gigabytes of data. And ultimately, Colonial Pipeline paid a ransom of nearly 75 Bitcoins, which was roughly $5 million at the time. And there's a quote here from the CEO of the Colonial Pipeline, and that really calls attention to the problem that they encountered. And that said, in this case, a legacy VPN had only single-factor authentication, meaning it was only a username and password. And although it was a very complicated password, it wasn't effective enough, or wasn't complicated enough, or was just stolen completely, and wasn't effective in preventing the breach. And indeed, whatever that password was the key that unlocked the front door for these hackers to get in. Another one, the Oldsmar water treatment plant. So this is, again, a Florida water treatment plant that was hacked. Their remote access capabilities were hacked. And what actually happened was the attacker was able to access the system and change the level of sodium hydroxide, or lye, from 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million. And now this happened very quickly, and it was caught very quickly by the team at the water plant, thank God. And it was rather mitigated quickly in that sense. But what you need to understand here is that there are some significant vulnerabilities within this environment that could have been exploited further. First of all of the computers in the water plant that were used by personnel were connected to the SCADA system. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in. We would typically suggest that those systems be isolated by network means or otherwise, SCADA systems potentially even air-gapped from the broader network, but certainly don't want to have them broadly connected to other machines that the personnel would be using within the environment. They're also using very outdated infrastructure. Again, not uncommon in these type of environments. You could even argue that Windows 7 is a little bit more recent than what you could find in some of these type of organizations. But that's something to be concerned about too, because a lot of these old operating systems are not really kept up to date with some of the more recent security patches and information to protect those machines. And so a lot of old vulnerabilities still exist in these machines that are still being exploited. All the computers shared the same password for remote access. Now, I don't think I probably need to explain to you why that's not the right way to go, especially considering that they were connected to the SCADA system ultimately. That's a major no-no. And they appeared to be connected directly to the internet without any type of firewall protection installed. Again, another big no-no. And the quote here I want to pull out, or the detail I want to pull out here, is that 11 credential pairs were found from 2017 in stolen breach credentials, meaning on the dark web in some database subsequent to this attack, they discovered that 11 credentials, username, passwords from 2017 had existed on the dark web. They also found 13 more recent credentials of the water treatment plant. And so, point being, they had been hacked many years ago, several years ago here, and those credentials may have still been valid if passwords hadn't been changed and used. And so awareness of them being breached may have been very helpful in understanding their vulnerabilities. But again, the more recent credentials were also found, meaning there was active attempts to go out and steal that type of information still being perpetrated against this organization. And then the final example I'll give here is the Broward School District. So obviously they're one of the nation's largest school districts. They were hacked by a criminal gang that encrypted all of their data and demanded $40 million in ransom. And you can see actually here on the right-hand side of my screen, it's probably a little tough to read it in the size of the font, I apologize, but this is actually the chat between the school district or the school district's representatives and the Conti Locker hacker team, where they're negotiating the payment of the ransom. And you can actually see the ransom is requested to be $40 million. And the gentleman here says, "I'm speechless. Surely this is a mistake. Are there zeros in that number by mistake? You know, this is a public school district." Meaning it's free for students. They don't have that amount of money. And that really didn't obviously matter all that much to the attackers themselves, although they did end up dropping their demand from $40 million to $10 million. Ultimately, this was not paid by the school district, and over 25,000 files were published. And this data, personnel data, student data, dating back to 2012 and leading through March 2021. So a large amount of data was eventually released here, and this was because they really were at the mercy of these cyber attackers. And so this really brings us to the portion of the presentation we want to talk about what's changed, how the threat landscape has maybe shifted over the past few years. And so the first thing I would say is that we've seen this as a part of the COVID-19 outbreak accelerate dramatically. But what we need to understand is that businesses have evolved today from having many offices or having offices with many employees to having nearly as many offices as employees. And so you think about the home office environment, you think about remote office environments, they're much more prevalent now. So after the pandemic, people are not working, at least in many parts of the country, are not working from their traditional offices as much. And this remote work use cases really expanded the attack surface into the homes of users and into multi-cloud environments. And I would argue that this is really a continuation of a long growing movement or a growing attack surface issue, right? If you think, in the early days of the internet, it was about protecting your infrastructure, limiting physical access, blocking external threats, preventing lateral movements. As you connected things to the internet, you really wanted to lock down people's ability to get into your environment. Then endpoints became more mobile. You had to have laptops that could travel with your users, whether it's to their home environment or when they were on the road. So now you had an attack surface on those endpoints where you needed to do more than simple antivirus for known protections. You needed to prevent, detect, and remediate. And then obviously you had the explosion of the cloud, where you're having to protect your assets on someone else's computer, which is a significant challenge. And then I would argue that with the phishing, the credential theft, insider threats that we've seen, users are really have dramatically increased the attack surface, right? Cyber attackers recognize that they are really the weak link in the chain, so to speak. And by exploiting them via phishing, this is much easier a much easier method to get into an environment than to try and find some other type of intrusion or vulnerability within the network firewall or something like that. And ultimately, all of these things have really expanded the use and scope of data that needs to be protected. Now data is everywhere. And so the attack surface has expanded dramatically. And then when you talk about ransomware specifically, I like to say that the value of data has shifted. It used to be that a cyber attacker would look for your most valuable data. That is to say the data that they could most easily monetize, could turn around and sell to people. So things like credit card numbers, social security numbers, that type of extremely sensitive data was something that they could monetize very easily. But with ransomware, they're really pivoting to exploit the value you place in your own data. Right, so it doesn't matter if it's all your personal photographs or a list of client names or whatever that piece of data is or that database is. It really comes down to what type of value are you placing in that. And I always give sort of the personal use case. You know, what if all of your children, your pictures of your children were encrypted and kept from you and you didn't have any backups, right? What would you be willing to pay to get that type of data back? And this is the same type of psychology that attackers are exploiting when they use ransomware. And so they're very good at exploiting these insecurities as well. They make their attacks time sensitive and urgent. And you can see here on the right-hand side, this is an old ransomware strain, but I think it does a nice job of showing this. You see that there's a timeline in when payments will be raised. There's a timeline and a ticker for when your files will be lost. They also have some help desk call center payment information. So, you know, if you've never bought Bitcoin and you need to pay a ransom, guess what? We can help you with that. Contact us, right? So they have a whole capability to facilitate payment and troubleshoot, in other words, to get people to pay their ransom and pay them back. And this is very, very common within ransomware strains today. And then the final point here is that, you know, ransomware as a service is also broadly available on the dark web. It's comforting to think, comforting but naive to think that attacks, ransomware attacks, take very sophisticated threat actors on the back end. The reality is today, the big boys, the smart hackers, many of them are monetizing the malware itself by making them available to less skilled attackers to actually execute their own attacks. That is to say, they'll create a ransomware strain, they'll put it on the dark web for sale, and then they'll charge a fee, maybe a 10% fee on ransom. And this abstracts them a little bit from the attack themselves and also allows them to make more off of their development of strains than even the attack itself. And the final point here is, you know, that identity is critical. And I have a number of terms up on the screen: zero trust, XDR, SASE. These security approaches ultimately come down to the idea of an identity, right? And the assumption that every device and user on or off network represents a security risk. And so you need to know who and what is connecting to the business network, and you can use that to help limit access to business critical systems. So only those devices that have explicit permission to use them. So identity, user identity, device identity, very, very important in this new era. So zero trust, we'll talk a little bit about zero trust in these next couple of slides, what it means. But to start out, you know, it's an executive order now. You know, the president put out an executive order in mid-May in response to some of the cyber attacks that we talked about a little bit earlier. And they explicitly call out that the federal government must adopt security best practices and advance towards zero trust architectures. So this is just a recognition by our own government that in the face of these cyber attacks, in this expanding threat landscape, that zero trust architectures really are the right approach to take to protecting your business. And so we'll talk about why that's the case here in the next couple of slides. So first of all, what is zero trust? So Forrester Research came out with this terminology around 2009. First popularized zero trust, and essentially it's a comprehensive approach to IT security, right? It's not a siloed approach. It's not for solving specific channels or challenges. It's much more broad approach for protecting your organizations. And it really calls organizations to apply stronger restrictions and redefine access controls. And we'll talk about how you can use risk to help us redefine access control and develop some of those restrictions. And ultimately, it assumes that nothing is to be trusted. Obviously, that's what the zero trust term means. And this is despite the relationship with a company network. And so why is this a relevant approach? Well, zero trust is important in large part because, again, users are being targeted more and more as the entry point to your organization. And we've seen, a 76% increase in remote access being expected in the next 2 years. So again, those users will be on their own to some degree, away from the network for large periods of time for the foreseeable future. So this is why it's in part an important approach. Also, more things are running in the cloud. So access becomes very, very important in controlling access to your cloud resources. And so, services are being accessed by users. Groups have different privileges within your own environment. And also, users are in different physical and logical locations, and they have a myriad of different devices and computers that they're using. And so zero trust really helps us minimize complexity in some specific areas around those ideas. So the basic principles behind zero trust are really ultimately never trust and always verify. And so what that process looks like is essentially identifying users and devices, right? So who is the user? That typically means applying multi-factor authentication, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides, as well as a username and password. And then also identifying the devices. And this could be the endpoint that they're using to connect, but also their mobile devices that they'll be using for the authentication challenge with a multi-factor authentication type of solution. So this is an important part of always knowing the who and the what that is connected to your business network. And when you know that, then you can start to provide that secure access. And this really means with zero trust, having the ability to centrally manage access across all of your common IT systems, and then limiting access to only specific users, devices, and applications. And you should be able to make these decisions in real time based on policies that you've predefined. And so I'll talk a little bit about our risk framework and what that looks like from real-time perspective in a couple of slides here. And part of that real-time capability comes down to your ability to continually monitor. So to stay on top of threats, you do need persistent ability to monitor the health of a device, even if it's off your network, right? Even wherever that device is, you need to understand the health and security posture of all of your managed endpoints, right? And so you can achieve this with things like machine learning, behavior-based detection. You're not going to really be able to achieve this on an endpoint with your traditional antivirus, which really only takes fingerprints of files and compares them to fingerprints of known malware, if you will. And it's not really an active monitoring for signs of threat on the devices themselves. And so the benefits of zero trust adoption here, it supports a rapid adoption of cloud and user security approaches. And this obviously very, very important as we see remote access increasingly in demand. It improves network visibility, and that can help us combat advanced and zero-day malware threats. And one of the ways it does this is by bringing that device identity, that user device, into the conversation, as well as providing that continuous monitoring of those devices and the user's risk profile. And then it can also help you reduce management costs with centralized security. Obviously that's important to most people. If you're adding security approaches or a new security technology, you want to be able to centrally manage that so it's a tenable deployment or a tenable infrastructure for you. I just have a simple diagram here that shows really what this sort of looks like, or what a risk-based authentication approach can look like. You have on the left-hand side here somebody who's connecting directly to the internet from their own device. They're outside of the network, or potentially they're outside of business hours, and they're going to be a higher risk profile here. So you're going to require them to use multi-factor authentication. Then maybe they're behind the network, they're using business hours, other people are connected within that network, You may not want to require them to use multi-factor authentication as often for a usability standpoint. And I always talk about this from the idea that you're all sitting in a number of cubicles. So if somebody has an authentication challenge or looks to be authenticated or trying to authenticate and they don't have that approval, your colleagues will know whether or not that person who's trying to use that device is the person who should be using that, because they're physically in that location. So you can be a little bit more flexible with how often they're required to respond to an MFA challenge. And this really speaks to a risk-based micro-segmentation approach, and where you can look at groups of users and start to apply risk assumptions based on different scenarios and dynamics. And so first thing to understand, your users are everywhere, so are your applications, right? So you need to start understanding what type of rules you want to build and apply on your applications and your resources, and then start to implement them. And so I have an image up here which shows the different groups of users and a number of scenarios. So you have salespeople who are working from the office. They are on that office network, and that says to us it's probably a lower risk because they're using that business laptop. We feel fairly confident, and then we'll allow them to use passwords as long as that stays the same. Technical support, they're traveling for work, they're on any number of networks, not the office network. You're going to want to use a push MFA, a QR code MFA. You want them to have a higher level of identity establishment. And really the point being that by looking at your teams and your groups of users, understanding their network location, their geolocation, time restrictions, are they connecting within specific business hours, the device risk, is the risk of the device, is the device patched, does it have signs of malware? Understanding all of this and creating a risk profile in real time allows you to apply really those granular controls and those segmentations and ensure that you're able to identify those users effectively, without being too cumbersome on the users in scenarios where they are judged to be very low risk.
Yeah, I want to just interject here briefly, and that's a great. I love this chart. I know it's kind of a lot of data in here, Stephen, but the thing I like about it is it really just explains how we're trying to have a zero trust, but have a higher bar for privileged accounts or privileged users or riskier users. And that's really the key concept that needs to be taken away, is that if you got somebody who's working in just a regular information worker, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, has a desktop computer at the office, doesn't do remote access, maybe you just give them MFA when they log in and that's it. But if it's IT folks who are accessing via remotely, or over the cloud, across the internet, at all kinds of times of day and night, we've got to ratchet that down. And so it's important to realize that the accounts that frequently get compromised, we always think it's going to be the user who clicks on a phishing link, which it's possible, and that's very common. But from account credentials perspective, the scarier ones are, admin accounts, IT leader types. Those ones are the riskiest. So this is a great job of kind of explaining those micro segments. And that's really the key concept that we're trying to enforce here is you got to segment the security, apply the rules to the right people.
Yeah, excellent point, Don. And we do have an ebook too. I have in the top right here of your screen that explains some of this in more detail and actually provides this chart. But one thing to understand too is you can do this with these columns, write these things down on paper and map out your own scenarios, your own groups of users, and go through that exercise. As you're trying to understand how this might be relevant for you and how this might help you with your own segmentation.
Yeah, we'll make sure everybody on the webinar gets that ebook too. So that's a good resource for risk-based authentication. We'll make sure they all get that.
Excellent. All right. So this really brings us into really the WatchGuard technology portfolio and ultimately how we can help here at WatchGuard. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with who WatchGuard is, we've been really in the network security space for over 20 years. Our original product lines were WatchGuard fireboxes, our firewall appliances, our UTM appliances. But really over the last 3 years, we've grown the business quite aggressively in expanding what we offer from a portfolio standpoint. We offer endpoint security, which I'll talk about each one of these in a little, well, the next two in more detail throughout the presentation. But we recently added endpoint security last year as part of an acquisition. Very strong endpoint security, several levels of security available to you, which I'll discuss in a bit. About 2 years ago, we also introduced our AuthPoint multi-factor authentication solution, and we also have a secure Wi-Fi product line. And these are all essentially feed into the WatchGuard cloud management portfolio, so you have a single pane of glass and the ability to manage your infrastructure and your secure environment within the WatchGuard cloud platform. And so one of the things that's important to understand that we're providing here at WatchGuard is really a user-focused approach to security now. Again, I mentioned that we are a traditional network security company. So this is a major departure for what WatchGuard had done in the past. And obviously, for the reasons I talked about in the beginning of the presentation, very, very relevant in today's landscape. And so if you look at this graphic in this image, you see on the top hand level, I have AuthPoint and the authentication methodologies that you would use to establish the identity of that user before allowing them access to a cloud application, before allowing them access to their on-premise resources. So, you know, what method of authentication are they using? Is it MFA? Are they using a push challenge? What group are they in? What's their network location? Are they connecting from a home network, their work network, somewhere else? Where are they physically located, right? Are they in your state, in your country, or does it appear that they're trying to connect from a country that you're not expecting them to? And then things like privileges, the time of day that they're trying to access, and the device risk, the mobile device risk itself. And so these are just a couple of the variables that we can look at with AuthPoint to understand the risk profile of that user in real time as they're trying to make that authentication. And obviously it's transparent really to the user. This is not something that they're having to take any action on. On the bottom fold here, we have the endpoint security capabilities, and a couple of them I'll call out here. Behavioral analysis, constantly monitoring the endpoint for behaviors that could indicate malware. Obviously signatures for known malware. In-memory anti-exploit, so living off the land type of techniques that can occur on your device. And then also things like URL filtering, blocking access to known risky places on the internet as a best practice, and things like patch management. Obviously patching very, very important for protecting all of our environments, but the ability to manage those patches, make sure they're up to date, and before you even allow these devices to connect to the cloud or your internal resources, ensuring that they have up-to-date patches is important. And so the output of this is, once all of these things have essentially been validated, this is what allows you to establish that identity and give permissions to access those cloud applications or users might be using, as well as those internal resources behind your firebox, things like your VPN, all of that infrastructure you have behind that firebox. And so one of the things that helps WatchGuard really achieve this, or really separates how we approach security at large, is what we call our identity framework. And fundamentally, what I want you to understand here is that the identity framework is the thread of identity that is persistent through all of our various products within the portfolio. So your user identity will be the same on the advanced endpoint and the multi-factor authentication, network security. Now, some of this is visionary. It's roadmap. But from an authentication standpoint, from the MFA standpoint, identity and the identity framework is essential component there. And so with AuthPoint, you get that risk-based authentication. You get hassle-free identity management. We have very extensive integrations, third-party integrations. We pride ourselves on building integrations with the solutions that you're using today. And we also have today direct integration with the firebox. So this means, if you have a firebox today or you're interested in the firebox, you don't need to have a radius server if you want to establish this. We also have unified user and device management. So with Active Directory, all of our WatchGuard applications, you can share group definitions and report by user group. And all of this is very, very important as you start to deploy zero trust, deny by default architectures.
Yeah, well, you're on that slide talking about not using Radius, right? One of the big holdups in the past with multi-factor was the complexity of deployment and the complexity of configuration. I can tell you that we can get WatchGuard's AuthPoint multi-factor configured to link to your Active Directory and your Office 365 in an hour or two, and then you can take it from there. But as far as those integrations go, we've integrated it with dozens and dozens of systems because it uses industry standards for that integration. Works really well, and again, super simple. So we've migrated to using it for every possible multi-factor, and I've got tokens from tons of websites in there too. So really great tool. Very, very excited about it. We've been using it for 2 years. We love it.
Excellent. Good stuff. So here's just a bit of a look at what the risk framework looks like within AuthPoint. And so you can see you have a method to configure authentication policies. You have the ability to use Active Directory group sync, and so use the same Active Directory groups within AuthPoint. You can establish policies around specific resources with specific authentication requirements around those resources, as well as risk-based policies. And we're expanding on what the risk policy capabilities are. Today, you have things like network location and time schedule. Network location being, are they on the physical network or your business network, and then time schedule, are they within a certain parameter of time, let's say business hours. So you have somebody on network in the office connecting within business hours. You might have a different risk profile and policy than if they're on network in the office but working outside of business hours. Say somebody's connecting for some reason at midnight. Maybe you want to have a few more authentication challenges or requirements around how they're interacting with your environment there to prevent insider attacks or something else going on there. Another thing I'd like to call out, I talked about in one of the initial hacks how there was, I think it was 17 credentials that had been found, or 11 credentials from 2017. That's actually what I think it was, that had been found on the dark web from I think it was the Colonial Pipeline attack. And that's a serious concern. I mean, the chances are they had no idea that those things were out there, or they'd even been subject to a breach in 2017. If you're familiar with the Verizon data breach report, I've seen upwards of, it takes like a mid-sized business upwards of 800 days to discover that they've been breached, right? That's a significant amount of time, over 2 years, essentially, to discover that you've been breached there. And so a couple of tools that we have available today within WatchGuard. The first one is the dark web scan. And that's the ability for you to go in and enter your email address, your domain information, and you'll actually have the ability that'll actually go out and automatically scan the dark web and all the known databases of hacks that have occurred, and find credentials that may have been exposed from your business. So it'll look for email addresses, it'll look for domains. And so this is a great way for you to do sort of an audit of your business. This is within the WatchGuard cloud platform to see where you might have some exposure. And so the dark web monitor, we're actually expanding this tool early next year. I think we'll expect this to actually actively monitor the dark web for these credentials. And so this would be a way of sort of in the background, just looking for those credentials and giving you the opportunity to recognize when you've been subject to a breach much earlier in the process. And so we're really excited about these tools. As I mentioned, the dark web scan is available today within WatchGuard Cloud. And we actually have a tool on the WatchGuard website that allows you to try this out a little bit as well and see what you find. I personally have done this, and it was shocking to me. I had credentials from many years ago that were up there from old breaches. So it's quite scary how much is actually out there. And this brings us to our endpoint security product line. And so I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is our newest product line here to WatchGuard. It's part of our Panda Security acquisition, which we made early last year. And really the output of this is we now offer 3 levels of endpoint security beyond just the traditional antivirus, which we have in our endpoint protection platform. So we have WatchGuard EDR, endpoint detection and response, and then our most advanced, our endpoint or endpoint protection, detection, and response. And so really 3 levels of endpoint security available to you today. And again, that can correspond to the risk profiles and the things that you're looking at for your users. Maybe you have users that they are only going to need the known protections, things like EPP protections against known threats. They're not a very risky profile. Or you have people who have very sensitive access capabilities. They're constantly on the move with their device, and you want to have a higher level of protection applied to those devices with EPDR. So again, a new solution to WatchGuard here in the last year or so. Very, very excited about it. We've gotten fantastic feedback from the customers so far. 2 other elements that we offer within this sort of endpoint product line, a threat hunting service that uses our team of cybersecurity experts to help suss out threats and create rules and push them out to endpoints to protect them against new attacks. And so this really allows you to get recommendations on how to mitigate attacks if you think those things are occurring. And then our Zero Trust application service. And this is very unique to us here at WatchGuard now. And basically what this allows you to do is take a very strong, locked down approach to your endpoint that actually classifies 100% of the processes running on the endpoints themselves. And then you can allow only goodware to execute. So only applications, processes, or DLLs that you understand to be goodware will be allowed to execute. And what this essentially means is you're actively monitoring and analyzing all of the different programs that are trying to execute on this endpoint and making those type of decisions. And so all these behaviors are actually verified by our internal analysts here. If you were to use this service, and ultimately this means that you get a very high degree of protection with not much effort on your end. So again, this is a very, I would say, aggressive way to lock down an endpoint. So if you have a high risk endpoints that you just don't want to have shadowware on or risk the idea of shadowware, those type of things on, this is a great tool and a unique tool available to you within the WatchGuard arsenal. And just a little bit of an example of what this looks like within the WatchGuard Cloud platform. It really does a nice job of mapping different attacks and indicators of attack to the MITRE framework. And so you can see how these elements occurred across that framework, from initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, all the way down through lateral movement, collection, exfiltration, right? It does a very nice job in bucketing the different indicators into those areas, so you have a very strong understanding of what really occurred with the cyber attack, and that can help you find maybe vulnerabilities and lessons learned can be applied thereafter. And so ultimately what you get with WatchGuard is what we call a unified security platform. It's simple, it's cloud native, it's extremely identity centric, and sort of this is sort of an abstraction of the architecture, and to be clear, this is a zero trust architecture itself, where I've just mapped our solutions to make it easier to understand. So on the left hand side here, you have your user risk and your device risk. And so, you know, your user risk, you have our AuthPoint multi-factor authentication solution. This has things like mobile device DNA, so we know very confidently that they're using the correct device, that device has not been cloned. We can use things like PIN or biometric access for the access to that device. And then we can do things like time of request, geolocation, those type of variables to establish user risk. One thing I didn't talk about in the presentation is our phishing protection capabilities with DNSWatch Go, which is a cloud-based service that'll actually block phishing attempts that your users might be subject to. So they get an email, they click a link that they shouldn't, we'll quickly cross-reference that with a database of known malicious phishing sites and block any connections that would be attempting to get there. This also works on command and control. So if a piece of malware, for example, were to hit a user's device, we would be able and try and call back to their attacker's infrastructure for further instructions or to get a payload, and we knew that to be a known malicious location, that callback could be blocked as well. Then on the bottom here, device risk, and this is really our endpoint security product line that I've talked about quite a bit. You know, for all of your managed devices, you get active protections, you get endpoint health, you get real-time monitoring, web and email protection, jailbreak and root detection for your mobile devices is also possible. And so really, from a user and device security perspective, WatchGuard has a very strong portfolio available to you today. And again, they feed into our WatchGuard cloud management platform. And this is really our place where we are able to establish and disseminate organizational policy to the various points in your security stack. At the bottom here, I have what's called our ThreatSync solution. I won't go into great detail here, but just think of this as the brain of WatchGuard Cloud that allows us to correlate threat telemetry from all of our various solutions. So you'll be able to see, you know, endpoint actions and telemetry or signs of threats can be correlated with network signs of threats, and that gives us basically a whole story of an attack. You know, we could see that there was an original email, let's say, that came through the firebox, and then an action occurred on the endpoint that indicated that a piece of malware had been dropped, and we can associate those two things together. And generate a single threat score. And this makes it much easier on your teams to prioritize what could be a threat and understand how to respond. And then on the right-hand side, this is really our network security approaches here with the firebox, your ability to protect all your internal applications, as well as apply all of your filtering to your network traffic. As well as facilitate things like VPN connections back to your firebox. And one of the other things that's really nice about our approach here, because we take this unified approach, is that there's a lot of automation capabilities that link these products together that allow you to really do more in less time as it comes to security. So things like your deployment being made easier, some of that correlation capability that I talked about, the idea that threat scores will be generated automatically. You don't have to try and make sense of what you're seeing from an indicators or compromise perspective. All of this is built within the platform in what we call our automation core. And so I'd like to leave you with a couple of key takeaways here. First of all, the threat landscape has changed. We talked about some of the dynamics with COVID-19, but also some of just the traditional expansions that we've seen as we've seen more remote connectivity, greater use of cloud applications, endpoints, more users being subject to attacks specifically. And our identity is critical. Again, comes down to user and device identity, always knowing who and what is trying to connect to your various sensitive places of your network. Zero trust is effective. You know, I mentioned that the president put out the mandate that essentially the federal government has to use zero trust. And that's an acknowledgement, again, that zero trust is the way to go in relation to what we're seeing in the threat landscape at large. And it's certainly something that should be considered really from any organization that's serious about securing themselves. Risk-based approaches can actually simplify security. It allows you to take a user-centric view of your security posture and really apply intuitive restrictions and controls that minimize some of the disruption to the users while also helping you maximize your security over how they're accessing various parts of your network. And finally, WatchGuard and Vertex, we have what you need. I think we have a very strong portfolio that can really help deliver zero trust and protect your business in light of all of the nasty cyber attacks we've seen here in the last 12 to 18 months. So with that, I really would like to thank you, and I'm very happy to take any type of questions you might have today, but I appreciate you spending a couple of minutes with us today.
Yeah, appreciate that, Stephen. A couple of things I want to point out to the audience. Number one is in the GoToWebinar dashboard, the control panel, you'll see a handout there, just a reminder. You can download this slide deck as a PDF by clicking the link in the handout section, so that's available to you. Also, we're going to continue to monitor chat and questions windows so we can answer your questions. Any questions we can't answer live during the webinar, I guarantee you, I promise we'll follow up and get you that information. But I do want to start by thanking Stephen, great presentation, but also asking a question, where to go for more information and how do we stay educated? I know that WatchGuard just came out with the latest internet security report, and there was a webinar about that. What's your recommendation for security professionals like we have on the webinar today and IT admins about how to stay educated? What kind of resources do you think they should avail themselves of?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So we have a number of resources available today. One of the first ones I would point folks to is our Simplicity blog post or blog, and it's simplicity.org. And it might not seem to be a WatchGuard blog, but that's actually our organization that runs it and our Threat Labs team that runs it specifically. And they do a really great job in deep diving on some of the recent breaches or security topics. It's really solution agnostic. They're not talking about product. They're not talking about fix in that blog. They're really ultimately talking about what went wrong, what are the lessons learned, those type of things. Don mentioned the Internet Security Report. We just recently released our most recent one. We do quarterly reports where basically we look at feed data from fireboxes that have been approved by our customers and partners and give us information on the threats that are being subjected to those fireboxes, as well as on the endpoint product lines and multi-factor authentication. And we're able to take the data, the raw data that we see from those type of attacks, things like what malware strains are being seen, what are the intrusions that are most actively being used out there, not just in the market at large, but our actual customer base and our partners out there as well. And there's some really interesting lessons to be learned there in those documents. One of the things that we've seen, just as sort of an example there, is a fairly dramatic increase in how malware is using encrypted traffic to sneak by a traditional firewall. So if you're not inspecting HTTPS traffic, as an example, you'd be missing quite a bit of malware now, and that's something that we continually see get worse. And then I'd say probably the final thing is we did just launch a new blog on the WatchGuard website where we talk more about really from a WatchGuard perspective, what's coming next and our view in security more broadly. And that we just released, I think, in late May. And those are great ways to sort of stay on top of things.
That's awesome. And also Brittany posted in the chat window to everyone a link to Simplicity. Simplicity is it's a training resource, an information resource, and a blog. It's not a sales pitch. It's in-depth information from ethical hacker types. It's very, very detailed and helps you kind of stay up to date. So I highly recommend Simplicity. That's one of the ones I always read. Mark La Liberty is always on there, as well as a couple other WatchGuardians, but great resource. And I posted another link to CompTIA's ISAL. Now, this is not free, but I know a lot of you are pursuing industry certifications like CompTIA Security Plus, Network Plus, CYSA Plus, which is one of their certs. CompTIA ISAL, you can join this group. It's a low cost, but they're very in-depth briefs as attacks come out that tell you exactly what happened, how they got through, and so on. So really good stuff in the ISAL. We monitor that as well, and so we try to put out information to our client base when it's relevant based on what we see in that CompTIA ISAL group. But that's another resource for you if you want to go a little bit deeper. So we'll continue to stay online for a minute or so and look at the Q&A and the chat windows to answer any last questions. That's the conclusion of the content for the webinar. We appreciate you joining. We recorded this. We'll post it on our YouTube channel and send a link out to everyone so you can share it or watch it on demand later if you like. Thanks and have a great day. And if we don't talk to you before the weekend, I hope you have a great Independence Day weekend and get some much needed time off. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.